Hi there, everyone. My name is Tina Quagliato-Sullivan. I'm going to be running the technical assistance workshop. I'm just going to give folks like 2 more minutes to see if anyone else comes into the room. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started, and then folks can just kind of join in. So just so everyone is aware, I am recording this session. I'm recording it for the purposes of being able to post it publicly after this session is done, so other folks that couldn't attend the workshop can access it. And I'm also recording it so I can revisit it afterwards and pull out any frequently asked questions that might be helpful to other folks. So I should introduce myself. I'm Tina Quagliato-Sullivan. I am the city's Director of Disaster Recovery, and our office is administering this neighborhood recovery fund. I don't know how familiar everyone is with the application. I'm going to sort of assume that most of the folks on this call are not familiar with it and haven't really dug into it. And if you have, well, then good for you. You can act like my husband and tune out 90% of what I'm about to say. I'm going to start with how you can obtain the application. I'm assuming everyone can see my screen. If you can't see my screen, please just raise your hand or pop that into the chat box. When you get to the city's main site, you select departments, and then you select disaster recovery. And the link for the Neighborhood Economic Recovery Fund is on the left-hand side. This webpage gives you a general overview of the program. So just so everyone is aware, the mayor has allocated $12 million of ARPA funding to go towards the recovery of neighborhood economies and business districts, and to sort of help the Springfield neighborhoods recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. So this page is where we'll post any general information about the application, changes to the application. If there are additional technical assistance workshops, they'll be posted here, and you'll see the ones that are already scheduled are posted down here. This also gives you information about how you can contact me and my office if you have questions. The application I'm going to go over tonight, so there are 2 applications under the fund. The one I'm going to go over tonight is the General Neighborhood Economic Recovery Fund application. There is a second application that is geared just towards neighborhood councils and or very specific nonprofits that have walkability or pedestrian safety in their mission. And that is specifically just for those organizations to submit requests for the city to consider funding sidewalk, street, and pedestrian safety improvements in neighborhoods. The general application, which I'm going to go over tonight, is broader and has a lot more eligibility for folks outside of neighborhood councils, but neighborhood councils are also eligible to apply under this, assuming they have an eligible project that would meet the criteria. So to get that application, you would utilize this link right here that says General Neighborhood Economic Recovery Fund application. Before I go into that link though, I just want to call out something else. The projects that will be funded under this application will either need to be located in or serve qualified census tracts. Qualified census tracts are areas, geographical areas that have been identified by the US Treasury as disproportionately impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. We have a map here of Springfield by street and neighborhood, and so folks can click on it and get a more detailed idea of what those qualified census tracts are. They are obviously the areas. Oh, sorry, we have someone who's not. Okay. So that's just so everyone understands that that's where you can find it. You on your own computer, you can click on this on your own time, scan in and out, and look at streets and different areas of the city and see whether they would be eligible under this funding. Now, to get the application itself, you click on this link and you pull it up and it brings you into the application portal. The application is split up into two parts. The first part is really informational, and then the second part is the meat of the application itself. My intention tonight is to go through the informational part of the application and then open it up for some questions, and then to go through the application itself and tell you and give you some information about how to fill it out and tips on what would score better when the applications are evaluated versus what might not score so well. Okay, so the first part is the introduction. This is pretty self-explanatory. This is also on the website, and it just sort of describes the fund and the general purpose of it. Part two. So to navigate through this, you can just click on these little numbers, and you can sort of see how I'm doing that, and it'll take you to all the different parts of the application. So you'll see sections 1 through 6. That's the application itself. It looks like a lot, but honestly, once you get into it, it's not that much once you're in there. It's just because we split it up to make it easily navigable. It looks like an awful lot. So let's start with what projects are eligible and how to apply for funding. So, like I said, specifically under this fund, projects that are within the qualified census tracts or that serve the qualified census tracts. Then we have also split out various categories and examples of projects that may fall within those categories. So the first category is public and commercial space activations. So this can be a whole variety of things. It can range from, retail and vendor markets to public art and cultural activities, public music. The idea here is we really want to reactivate our neighborhood commercial districts and those public community spaces that we share. So almost anything that could fit into that category could potentially be eligible. So this could also include for businesses, storefront improvements, and exterior lighting upgrades that would improve visibility and walkability and public safety. It could include improvements to access public transit or some of the public biking that's available in the city. It could be anything that could improve the commercial character of the neighborhood business district and attract folks to come to that district or to walk around that district. It could also include projects that would activate vacant commercial space. And what do we mean by that? So that could be commercial pop-ups. It could be pop-ups is the one, I guess, that immediately comes to mind. Some other creative ideas we've seen to activate vacant commercial space on a temporary basis are also pop-up markets in commercial space. So there's sort of a wide variety of things that could fit into this category. The idea, again, of this category is things that will make these neighborhood commercial districts and these neighborhood cores walkable, pedestrian friendly, will attract customers, or that would improve the neighborhood health of residents as they're walking around the district. So also, if there was an organization that wanted to offer outdoor exercise classes in that district, or even indoor in a vacant commercial space, and they could work out a project that made that happen, those are things that could be eligible. The second category is digital equity projects. So what do we mean by that? Because that's sort of a buzzword. But I think the idea behind this category is any project that could help sort of bridge that digital divide for residents. So it could be computer skills training. It could also be something that improved accessibility for populations that were disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. So for instance, something that made, excuse me, maybe a database that, or a website that created better access to public services, to neighborhood services. Anything like that could potentially be eligible. Then one of the other things that could be eligible here that we talk about is a creation of a neighborhood digital marketplace. So maybe your neighborhood, or the neighborhood that your organization serves, has a business district. Maybe it hasn't been branded very well. Maybe it hasn't been advertised very well. If those businesses sort of wanted to get together, or that district wanted to get together and create some sort of website that helped market the district better, or helped merchants in that district sell their product better, that could potentially be something that would be eligible. The idea here is to sort of address the digital gap between disproportionately impacted residents and the neighborhood economy in the best way we can. The next category would be communications infrastructure. So again, here, I think we're sort of recognizing that not all residents, businesses, or communities have the same equal access to communications infrastructure. So what we have put into this category, potential projects, could be, again, upgrades or creation of neighborhood business district websites or social media accounts. I will say, just sort of as a tip here, I think if an individual business was applying to for funding to launch a digital marketing campaign, that probably wouldn't score as high as if a neighborhood commercial district was applying to do an overall marketing campaign for the businesses in that neighborhood. I think the idea here is we really want to get to a community or neighborhood benefit versus just a benefit for any one business, organization, or individual. Other projects that could potentially qualify under here would be if a group of businesses or organizations had strategies to address some of the, I'm sorry, I skipped to the next category. I apologize. Let me just go back. So again, Under communications infrastructure, databases, websites to promote community news or resources, to market business districts, to market community resources. Those are all things that would potentially be eligible. Also, any digital site that would, would highlight disproportionately impacted local businesses and communities, things like that. Another category of eligible projects is, we put it under upgrading the new economy. And what does that mean? So I think what we mean by that is any project that would potentially help neighborhood commercial districts or neighborhoods adjust to sort of what we're calling the new normal. So that businesses have to be, able to do takeout orders and curbside orders. They need to have a really impressive and user-friendly digital platform. Those are all things that we would include under here. Again, like I started to say when I was talking about the last category, any strategies that might address current staffing and supply chain shortage issues would potentially be eligible under here. But again, we want to try to get to neighborhood or community benefit versus benefit for just one individual business. Another category of eligibility would be resident outreach and neighborhood capacity building. So this category, I think folks have found a little confusing, but our idea here is to try to fund projects that could build partnerships or organizational capacity that would allow neighborhood organizations or nonprofit organizations to implement strategic neighborhood improvement plans. I think a lot of times the city hears from folks that there are great plans to turn around or benefit the neighborhood, but there isn't capacity there to carry it out. So this could potentially fund something along those lines. So an example of that might be, you have a neighborhood housing organization. The neighborhood has a plan to do all kinds of housing projects, but the neighborhood housing organization needs technical assistance, perhaps from another organization or entity that could bring that expertise into the neighborhood organization. That could potentially be an eligible funding category. Other things that would potentially be eligible here would be projects that could strengthen two-way communication channels with neighborhood residents or improve public access to public programs or neighborhood or housing resources. So maybe your organization has an idea for a program or a website that could, advertise affordable housing resources within the neighborhood. That could potentially be an eligible project. I'm going to move on through the categories, and then I might allow folks, I might take questions at the end of this section, just because there's kind of a lot of information here, so we can get through that and then move on. The next category is essential neighborhood businesses. So when we talk about essential neighborhood businesses, we mean those businesses that could improve health outcomes for communities and businesses that provide essential public services. So it could be pharmacies, it could be grocery markets that serve fresh, whole foods. It could potentially be health clinics, childcare facilities. And so eligible projects within this category could include commercial rehabilitation for these sorts of businesses, soft cost investments in development, and or tenant fit out for eligible businesses. So maybe your neighborhood doesn't have one of these businesses, but you want to start one and you have a location to do that in. or you own a building and you have a tenant that would fulfill one of these categories, but you need funding in order to fit out that space, this could potentially be a source of funding for that. Moving on to the next category, essential community facilities. So again, this is sort of all of those facilities that we think about when we think of critical public services in neighborhoods. So it could include community centers, educational facilities, libraries, playgrounds, youth development, childcare facilities, health facilities, all of those sorts of things that are critical to neighborhoods and also to health outcomes in neighborhoods. Again, because this is COVID funding, we do have to sort of tie everything back to the pandemic. So that's why we're focused on these particular categories. Eligible projects could include investment, expansion, or improvements to a neighborhood health center or to one of these sorts of facilities to either create them if they don't exist, or to build out existing facilities to better serve the needs of the neighborhood. Now, I do want to sort of remind folks that there's $12 million in this fund. So, you know, I don't think it's realistic to think that the city is going to be able to fund out of this particular fund new, you know, giant community centers in every neighborhood. So I think, you know, just sort of keeping that in mind, keeping both the eligible categories, but also the total amount of funding in here in mind, just want to give folks that background. The last category is sort of, as we're trying to make this as flexible as possible, we're saying there is the possibility of other economic recovery projects that are specific to the neighborhood's needs that maybe we haven't listed out in this extensive list that we're not thinking of. But as folks go through the application, they say, well, you didn't really specifically call out this type of project, but it fits all of the criteria. There's sort of that option for that to happen. So now that I've covered the categories, I'm going to say the application deadline is June 15th, 2022. Be sure to have your application in by then. I will say applications that come in before then, we're going to try to review them in groups as they come in, so it doesn't all happen at the end of the application period. And hopefully we'll begin to make funding announcements throughout the application period if possible. That's not a guarantee, but that's sort of our hope right now, depending on how quickly applications come in and the sorts of applications that come in. I should also say, if you are an individual, a senior, a household, or a business that doesn't necessarily meet the neighborhood or community impact that this particular fund is going to, then you are still potentially eligible for ARPA funding, but you should be utilizing the applications that are available under the Department of Recovery and Business Continuity, and those are specific to those categories. Okay, so before I move on, because I think there was kind of a lot of material to cover there, I'm just going to open it up for questions and let folks ask any questions if they have them. You can just raise, if everyone knows how to raise their hand on Zoom. Anybody? No questions? Okay. Then I will move on.
Sorry,
Okay.
Sorry, I did have a question.
Oh.
I can also maybe, this is Betsy Johnson. How important does every project need sign off or sort of submittal with a neighborhood council as well?
So I will talk about that when I get to the application itself, but what I will say is that there are various ways to show neighborhood support. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the neighborhood council. And I can show you where that is in Section 2 neighborhood support and project benefit, there are all of these ways that an applicant could show neighborhood support. So letter of support from the neighborhood council is one of them, but we didn't want to put the onus just on the neighborhood council. So they could potentially get a letter of support from a city councilor or the city council ward rep. They could potentially get letters of support from a bunch of neighborhood residents. They could potentially get letters of support from community-based organizations, or from some neighborhood businesses, or from other elected officials that represent the city. So we didn't want to tie everyone in to the neighborhood council. We also didn't want to put that obligation on the neighborhood councils to try to hear everyone's ideas before the application is due. So we wanted to give folks a bunch of different options to show neighborhood support. Obviously, getting support from the neighborhood council is a great way to show neighborhood support and is something that we encourage, because if you're going to do something that's going to benefit and impact the neighborhood, talking with the neighborhood council is usually a good idea. Is that helpful?
Very much, thanks.
Okay, and then I saw a question in the chat box which says, can someone apply for more than one business idea? Yes, you could potentially apply for more than one. And the city, again, it's a competitive funding round. So I think the city would fund the best ideas and the ones that can demonstrate the most neighborhood benefit and sort of meet all of those criteria. I think I see Councilor Govan also raising her hand.
Yes, hi, thank you so much. This is so exciting. I'm just excited that we're continuing to encourage our residents and our neighborhoods to participate in this process. A question that I had was, if a neighborhood council wanted to apply for multiple projects in one, is that possible to do, or do they have to separate them?
Yes, so a neighborhood council could apply for multiple projects. Neighborhood council can also apply under the general application and can apply under the separate application that is geared towards neighborhood councils and pedestrian safety. In fact, we would encourage them to do both. We very much want to see applications. So
Thank
yes.
you.
Yep.
Thank you so much.
And I should also say, if a neighbor, so there are some neighborhood councils that are recognizing that they may have capital needs that go beyond just what is in this fund. They can also apply through the general ARPA application. And the idea is we will try to fund what we can out of the neighborhood fund, and what we can't, we'll sort of direct folks back over there if they haven't already put in an application there, or we'll cover it if they put in both. So we're in pretty regular communication with the Department of Recovery and Continuity that's been newly created to sort of oversee the umbrella of the funds. And when I talk about the review process, you'll also see that things are sort of getting reviewed at the department level and then are bouncing up to that higher level to also get reviewed up there to avoid any sort of duplication. I see a raised hand under someone listed iPhone, but I don't have a name. So if you want to go ahead. Hi. Do you want to go ahead and ask your question? No. Are you all set? Okay, I think maybe you're all set. If you're not, I'm going to move on, and you can just go ahead and stop me or pop your question into the chat box. So we've covered qualified census tracts, which is project locations. We've sort of covered eligible categories and examples of eligible projects and the deadline. So I'm going to move on to the next section. Who can apply for funding? I think we've mostly covered this, but we didn't want to eliminate anyone. So individuals, do I think a lot of individuals are necessarily going to meet the eligibility requirements? Probably not, but we wanted to leave it open because sometimes we have individuals that do business as a certain entity. So we didn't want to disqualify them without seeing application or what their project is. Obviously, community-based organizations, neighborhood councils, nonprofits, businesses, business districts, all of those sorts of folks would be eligible. I should say that the city requires by policy that before we can enter into contract with someone, if you have outstanding financial obligations to the city, you would have to settle them. It wouldn't necessarily preclude you from an award, but before we could go to contract, if you owed taxes or had outstanding fees, those would have to be paid before we could go to contract. And then obviously these are federal funds. So if your organization has a significant history of non-compliance with past federal funds, so if we've monitored you before and you've gotten findings, or you have been given a payback notice and you haven't paid back, or you're in arrears on a federal loan that we've given, then you probably wouldn't end up being awarded funding. So, but honestly, I can't think of many organizations that meet that criteria. Again, because we're saying significant history of non-compliance, not that maybe, there have been some errors that we're working out. This is really like you've defaulted on a loan, or you have some sort of serious outstanding issue. Moving on to the next floor, how to obtain application assistance. So obviously this is our first technical assistance workshop. I am encouraging as many folks as possible to come to these workshops so I can answer questions, but you can also reach me via email. You can reach me by phone. That information is all in here. My hope is to post any frequently asked questions. So if I'm getting the same questions a lot, I'll draft up a document for frequently asked questions. I will post that on the website that I pulled up earlier. And then, and so that's really it. I should also say announcements about the grant. So that would include funding announcements, any changes, deadline changes. If there are new technical assistance workshops, those will be advertised on our website, which is where I pulled this application up from. I should also say they will be also advertised on our Facebook page and on the city's Facebook page. I put those links in the chat box. I should say, this is a plug, our development services division, housing, community development, disaster recovery, economic development planning. We have a separate Facebook page from the city's Office of Communication. If you're on Facebook and you're not following it, I would urge you to do so. We post lots of updates there. I also posted the city's communications Facebook page there, so folks can follow that as well if you're on there. But those are the places where we post lots of announcements and updates on projects. So if you're on social media, I would urge you to follow both so you can get those updates and you don't miss them. And then, like I said, they'll also be posted on the website. The next section is how applications will be evaluated. So each application will go through an evaluation process. There are actually two separate review committees, and you can see the review committee is from various departments in the development services division of the city, and someone from the either finance or recovery and business continuity will be part of that evaluation process. And then the second committee is the higher level committee. That's the mayor, his chief of staff. There's some representatives, some cabinet level representatives that will evaluate each of these applications. Every application will go through that two-tiered review process to sort of make sure everyone's on the same page. We're not duplicating any benefits that are getting paid out, and to make sure that there's sort of that level of fairness and transparency. It's not any one person at the city making a determinative decision. It's sort of two groups of people making those decisions. The categories. So equity. So what we mean by that. Will the project provide some level of equity for low income or businesses that are Black, Indigenous, people of color, for either, so we're looking for a benefit for any of those populations in your application. Second category, neighborhood recovery. So what we're looking for here is for you to demonstrate how your project will help facilitate the neighborhood's economic recovery. How will it stimulate additional community-based activity within those commercial districts, within that neighborhood, and help stimulate economic growth to help folks recover from the pandemic, particularly around the neighborhood? So this is sort of where we're getting to that neighborhood benefit that I keep talking about and touching upon. We're sort of looking for projects that are going to go beyond individual or business benefit. It's sort of how will this project benefit the neighborhood or the business district recover from the pandemic. The third way we're going to review applications is addressing the harms of COVID-19 and improving health outcomes. So like I said earlier, these are federal funds geared towards COVID-19 recovery. So it's important for us to show that every project is responsive to the impacts of the COVID pandemic, and that every project will sort of improve the overall outcomes for those disproportionately impacted populations. And so when we talk about disproportionately impacted populations, those are residents or businesses within those qualified census tracts. Those are low income populations. Those are, businesses and communities of color. You have to show that these projects are going to provide benefits for those groups of folks. Community supported. So this is where we talked about the importance of demonstrating community support. So that's the letters of support from neighborhood councils or from elected representatives, or, if you can't get either of those or they're a challenge, we don't want to put up too many barriers for folks to apply either. So, a group of businesses you could get letters from them. You could get letters from groups of residents. And then the last part is where we're going to look at your plan and is your plan and your project going to achieve the stated goals? Have you demonstrated that your business group or your organization has the ability to carry out the project as it was proposed? I talked about where we would make award announcements. That will be on the city's website, as well as those social media pages. They'll be posted publicly. We'll also obviously notify individual grantees as they're being awarded, but places to sort of look out for that and follow and regularly check. I should also say in here, it's competitive funding. So you want to make your application and your project as competitive as you possibly can. Sometimes that means giving us a lot of information, and that's okay. It's totally okay to attach more things than you think we might need, because it helps better frame your project or gives us more information. You should approach this as the people that are reading your application are people that know nothing about you, they know nothing about your organization, and they know nothing about your neighborhood. Even though I hope that from the city side, we do know about your neighborhood and your organization, but you should approach it as if we don't. We know nothing. So give us all of the relevant information that makes the strongest case possible for your project. Here, I just want to talk about some of the additional federal funding requirements. These are requirements that we have no control over. We have to ensure that they are followed. And we, as the grantee and the pass-through entity for the funding, is also obligated to make sure that they are followed. So I want to make everyone aware of them on the front end. For applicants that are a nonprofit organization, you will likely, unless you are a direct beneficiary, which I think is going to be fairly hard to show for a nonprofit organization, because likely you're going to be proposing a program that will serve beneficiaries in some way. You will be designated as a subrecipient. And so what that means is the city then becomes the pass-through entity. And as a subrecipient, you assume the same federal procurement requirements that the city has. So that sounds a lot scarier than it actually is. What it really means is if you're going to be purchasing goods, services, or supplies outside of your organization, that's between $3,500 and $150,000, you need to get quotes. You need to try to get 3 quotes. If you can't get 3 quotes, then you'll have to write up some justification for why you couldn't get 3 quotes, but you made every effort to sort of obtain those 3 quotes. If you're going to be purchasing goods, services, or supplies outside of your organization that exceeds $150,000, which I think is going to be fairly unlikely for most nonprofit organizations that would get funded through this grant. I've been doing this for 17 years. I've only seen it happen a handful of times. But if you are, then you have to actually solicit competitive proposals for that purchase. And cost has to be a criteria. If you are proposing construction over $2,000. So this is separate of supplies, services, goods, those sorts of things. This is like hard capital construction. You have to develop an independent cost estimate, a written scope of work, and solicit competitive bids. And then you have to award it to the lowest bidder. Now, I will say you don't necessarily need to do these things before you submit your application, but if you are awarded funding, this will be in your contract. These will be things you'll have to follow. We sort of provide technical assistance for organizations as they're going through that process once they're under contract with us, but you will need to provide proof of those things to the city once you're under contract. Additionally, if you don't sort of seek those quotes before you submit your application and you misquote the cost of a good supplier service, it's not likely that there's going to be funding available to increase your contract. So you want to be sure that you have a pretty firm grasp of the cost that you're going to put in your budget. Additionally, nonprofits and subrecipients will be required to submit quarterly reports of all activities and accomplishments throughout the contract period. I hope that makes sense to everyone. I'm going to stop after this section and also just let some questions, just in case folks have some questions, just because I know this can be a little complicated in the weeds. Now, if you are an applicant that is a business or an individual that will be what's considered direct beneficiary of the funding, right? So you have the impact or the harm from the pandemic, and this funding is going to somehow address that harm. So a good example of that would be a business that is going to do storefront upgrades, right? So yes, you have an impact. Your business probably received less foot traffic. Obviously, businesses were shut down for that period of time back in 2020. So there's a direct impact to your business. You're also addressing an impact to the neighborhood by improving your storefront, right? So you sort of qualify in that way because your improved storefront will bring in more foot traffic and will attract more customers, and it will help overall improve the economy of the neighborhood. So you sort of have both things. You're considered a direct beneficiary. So some of the same rules apply to you, but it's not quite as nitty-gritty. What you'll need to do is any construction work that exceeds that 2,000 or any purchase of goods, supplies, and services that exceed 3,500, you're going to have to obtain quotes to show that the costs that you're proposing the city fund are reasonable. Again, you don't necessarily have to do that in your application, but it makes a much stronger application if you do that. So here's another example. You're applying for tenant fit out for an essential business. You're going to provide fresh food service, doesn't exist already. You are putting in for funding to put in all the shelving and help fund some of that fit out cost. What you need to do is basically just find contractors that you would consider hiring for that work and get multiple quotes from them. I would suggest doing that before you submit your application, so you can kind of put in your complete package, and the city then doesn't have to come back to you before an award and say, okay, did you get quotes? Can you show me the quotes? Can you prove that the costs that we might fund here are reasonable? Because that's really the requirement here. The federal government wants to make sure that any of this public money that's being spent is being spent for reasonable costs that are justifiable and that would be comparable to what would be spent in the private market if it wasn't a public entity funding it. So I hope that that explains that. The last piece that is somewhat complicated, but which I hope will not really apply to many applicants, is if you are applying for capital expenditures that will exceed 1 million. So capital expenditures are any type of hard change to basically a building or construction or anything along those lines. The federal government has not necessarily discouraged that in their regulations that they just recently put out, their final regulations around the funding, but they are saying that, you know, they are trying to gear the majority of the funding into programming. So if you're going to propose a large capital expenditure, you kind of have to jump through these additional hoops. So you would need to obviously give a written description of the harm that will be addressed by the capital expenditure and why that harm was exacerbated or caused by the public health emergency, an explanation of why a capital expenditure is the only appropriate answer to that problem, basically, and why an existing facility, program, or policy change wouldn't necessarily address that harm. So what do I think that, so I don't anticipate us getting lots of applications of this amount, but if we do, I think we're sort of looking for folks to put in as much of that basic information as they can into that section. And then we will likely have to work with folks to really firm this up before any kind of funding could be awarded. The last hoop that the feds are asking us to jump through for this sort of large capital expenditure is an analysis of at least 2 alternative capital expenditures to demonstrate why the proposed project is the only feasible solution. So, say you're proposing a totally new community center, which, you know, again, there's $12 million in the fund. So, you know, we want to try to just keep proportions into our head, but say you were. And the way this would work is you would have to show other alternatives. So maybe your other alternative is you looked to renovate an existing facility and it's just not feasible. You would have to show that you did an analysis of what the dollar amount of renovating that existing facility would cost and why it won't work for the needs of your neighborhood or community. The other option, another way you could show an alternative, is you looked at other sites and you could show that you did a financial analysis of those others, of that other site or those other sites, and why they weren't a feasible option to serve the needs of the applicant. Okay, so, and then the other last piece of this section that is sort of another federal requirement that we have no control over is the entity can't be federally debarred or excluded from federal funds. So I have, in my 17 years with the city, I have yet to come across an entity in Springfield that is federally debarred. So hopefully none of you are. And now I'm going to stop and just take some questions on what we've covered here and let folks ask any questions if they have them.
Hi, Tina. It's Jose Claudio. How are you?
How are you?
I'm just asking if there are any prevailing wages have to be used for any grants, since it's federal money. Do we have
Yes.
to use prevailing wages?
So the feds have said that prevailing wage, Davis-Bacon specifically, will not apply to anything under $10 million.
Okay, good.
So it's different from CDBG, which is good. They are encouraging folks to enter into fair labor agreements, but haven't set that requirement. And it's not, in my opinion, and I think the opinion of our attorneys and law department, if the city is just a pass-through entity for the funding, it is not public construction under state procurement. And this, the city's not going to keep ownership of the building or the structure or anything like that, or the improvements. It wouldn't fall under state prevailing wage laws. So that so far is our understanding of the regulations.
Thank you.
Certainly, if there's a change, we will put that out there publicly. But that is our understanding to date. Does anyone else have any questions about this?
And one more question, one follow-up question. Can we partner up? Let's say if we want to fix a park, can we partner up with any city like the Parks Department and try to, as a neighborhood council, help apply for those funds? Even if we could work with the Park Department?
Yeah, you could potentially do that. I don't see any reason why you couldn't. You could potentially do that. I think, again, we just want to sort of keep the scale in mind with the amount that's in the fund. There is also the possibility that, the city may come back if the cost is more than what we could fund out of this fund. We may say, okay, we're going to accept a portion of this, and you may have to put in also under the general application, and a portion could potentially be funded under there. But I think we don't really know the answer to that until we see the applications, but I don't see why that.
Actually, on the other hand, a Community Preservation Act proposal would probably be more appropriate for a park renovation.
Yes, it could be. They have open space funding as well. And so, like I said, what we may do is we may accept the application if it meets sort of the criteria, or we may direct folks to other appropriate pots of funding if we don't think it's something we can fund. Does that make sense?
Thank you. Yes.
Okay. Any other questions before I move on? No. Okay. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the application itself. And my goal here is just to sort of explain some of the things that I think might trip folks up. Some of it I think is fairly self-explanatory. So a lot of this first section I think is pretty self-explanatory. Your project title, the name of the organization you represent, the name of your contact person, contact information, phone numbers, email addresses, all that stuff. DUNS numbers. If your organization has a DUNS number, awesome. Click yes, pop it in here. If you don't know what a DUNS number is, it's a number that's assigned by the federal government. If you click no, you'll see information on how to obtain a federal DUNS number is there. It's a really quick process. Jose actually just did it the other day. We will need a DUNS number to enter into federal contracts with most folks, with the exception of certain individuals and things like that. So it won't preclude you from potentially getting awarded funding, but before we can enter into a contract, you'll have to obtain that DUNS number. So it might be worth your time to just make that phone call. Honestly, I think you get it in less than 24 hours. So that's all. Again, this is the section that I went over. Is your organization federally debarred or excluded? I have yet to come across an organization that is. If you click yes, we can't give you federal funds. So most folks would likely click no. If you don't know if you're federally excluded, it means you're not. So just to give you that information. I think this is fairly self-explanatory. If you fall into one of these categories, you click it. If you're in some other category, you just click other and pop in what category the applicant falls into. You put the total amount of funding that you're requesting through this fund in this box, anticipated project start date, a handy little calendar pops up, anticipated project end date, again, a little calendar, you pop that in. And then here you provide a description of your proposed project. You want to be as detailed as you can, right? Because you're trying to convince 2 committees of people that your project is worth funding out of this limited pool of funding. So be detailed. The next section is neighborhood support and benefit. So you would select the neighborhood that applies. If you don't know what neighborhood the project is located in or it will serve, we have that handy dandy map that is on our website. I hope you can see what I just clicked on. You can click on it, find your street, you'll see what neighborhood you're in. If your project will support multiple neighborhoods, you can click that. You can click more than one, totally fine. Again, if there's some neighborhood combination or some neighborhood that isn't in here, so there are neighborhoods in the city that aren't official neighborhoods. One that I can think of off the top of my head is Hungry Hill. You could click other and pop that in and provide more description in there. Does your project have neighborhood support? If you click no, all of that other section is going to go away, but you're not likely to get funded, right? Because the whole idea here is we want neighborhood supported projects that demonstrate positive neighborhood and community benefits. So you want to click yes, and you want to show neighborhood support. So we sort of went through this earlier. I'm not going to go through it in more detail. If you have specific questions about this, you can call me or email me. Happy to answer them and get you in the right direction. If you don't know how to reach your city councilor, I provided a link here so you can find city councilors, and it has all their contact information. If you don't know how to reach your neighborhood council or organization, I've also provided a link here. You can click on it. It will bring you to the city's website where we list out neighborhood organizations and their contact information. If you are a member of a neighborhood organization or an officer on a neighborhood council, and you click through that link and you notice that your neighborhood contact information is not right, please let me know and we'll make sure we change it so folks get the right information. I've also put a link here. If you don't know how to contact your state representative or your state senator, or you don't know how to contact Congressman Richard Neal to try to get his contact him to get his support on your project, you don't need his support, but if you wanted to get it, I've provided links to that information and to their contact information so you can easily reach out to them. This little upload box here, you can click on it and you can upload all of your attachments. So that would be your letters of support. This is the spot where you upload those. This box here where we say describe the COVID-19 impacts or harms experienced by the community or neighborhood, this is where you're talking about the COVID impact that your project is going to address. So maybe you're, again, I'm going to go back to businesses because this is easy, low-hanging fruit for me. But if you are a business and you're going to do storefront improvements, right? You have the direct impacts that your business experienced, but also the impacts that the neighborhood experienced. So all of the businesses in the neighborhood were shut down, including yours. There was no foot traffic. There was nobody at those businesses. Those created severe harms for these communities, particularly communities in qualified census tracts, because there was already disinvestment in those communities. So you want to put as much of that information in here as you can, because you're trying to convince committees of people that your project warrants funding. And then here you're going to describe how your project addresses those harms. So that's the solution to the problem, right? So I'm creating a neighborhood community health program that and that program is going to improve health impacts for folks that were already experiencing health issues prior to the pandemic. And we know that the pandemic disproportionately impacted disadvantaged communities more than regular communities. Fill all of that information in here. Be as detailed as you can. If you have more detail than can fit in these boxes, attach pages of detail for me. We love detail. So as much as you can provide, the better. And then again, you're talking about how your project, so in this box, how your project will benefit the targeted neighborhood or community. How your project, this box is talking about how your project will help stimulate neighborhood economic activity in these commercial districts in the qualified census tracts. And then you want to talk about how your project will promote equity under certain targeted disproportionately impacted communities. Now, we didn't make up these disproportionately impacted communities. They came from the federal government. They're in this, giant 100-page legislation of rules that they released to us within the past year. So that's why this is in here, because, we need to show that these projects are going to provide positive benefits to the folks who were most impacted and the communities and neighborhoods that were most impacted by the pandemic. Okay, so I'm going to stop here real quick and just see if folks have any questions about the neighborhood and support benefits section.
Hi, this is Yvette Frisbee. I do have a question. In the boxes where you're asking for description, is there a word count minimum or maximum?
I don't know that answer. I'm assuming there is some determined by the program, but they don't tell us what it is. So
Okay.
If you run out of space at the end of the application, and I'll sort of go back to there's an extra upload box. You can, on any of these upload boxes, you can upload up to 20 attachments. Mm-hmm. So your other option too is you can write out the answers to these questions in a Word document if you are afraid that you're going to run out of space, and you can just attach it to any of these upload boxes, and in your little box here just wrote see attached description.
Okay. And then my other question is it possible to get this in a PDF or a Word document to work on it separately? Because it seems like it's going to be more of a cut and paste.
I'm sure, yes, I'm sure there is definitely a way for me to PDF the application for you. There is also a way to save your work. So, we already had a neighborhood council who's put in an application and said, oh my God, I filled it all in and I got to the end and I wanted to save it to show my board before I submitted it and I couldn't save it. So you can save it and then you can come back to it. See, it gives you the link.
Okay.
Or you put in your email address and it can email you your link and you can come back and work on it.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Sure.
Does anyone else have any questions on this section before I move on? No. Okay. If you come up with a question, you can just stop me and I'll stop. Okay. The next section is section 3. This is your budget, right? So this is where you're telling us what you want funding for. You should try to be detailed. You have, so this little button that says add item, this is where you put in your description. So maybe you're a business and you want funding for a new awning out front. So you type in awning and then you put your funding amount. It will automatically total up at the bottom. So each line item will total up. Maybe you're an organization and you're going to run a program. So you're looking for staffing for a program manager. And that staffing cost is going to be $10,000. You put in that staffing cost and you can just keep adding items here to get to your budget total. You want to try to add in as many line items as you can to show us the detail. Because again, you should approach this as if the people reviewing the application know nothing about you or your organization or your project. So you want to give us the detail about what you're requesting that funding for and what the items are. Here, we've also provided an additional box where if you want to provide more narrative, you can. You aren't required to, but if you want to, you can. Then we ask you, will there be other sources of leverage funding contributed to your project? So maybe you have some kind of, you are going to be starting a program and you already have some internal funding for it, or you're going to be doing some sort of tenant fit out or construction and you already have some other funding for it. So if you click yes, a little box will pop up and then you can put in the information regarding your additional funding in there. If you click no, then the box goes away and you don't have to put anything in there. However, what I should say is if you request from the city $50,000, but you're telling us your overall project cost is going to be $100,000, you're going to want to put that leverage funding in there so we can see where it's coming from, right? We're trying to not see gaps here. Then we also ask, is the applicant a nonprofit organization? If you click yes, then what's going to pop up here is the information that I went over earlier in this session about the different rules that apply to nonprofits. We also put another upload box here. So maybe you want to submit your nonprofit's board members or support from your board, a letter of support from your board here. You can do that. Hi, Betsy, I see you raised your hand.
Yeah, nonprofit refers to, you can be a Massachusetts registered nonprofit. That does not mean that you are a qualified 501c3 to the IRS. And so what are you meaning by nonprofit? Because most of the neighborhood councils are actually 501c4s.
Sure. So I am meaning any organization that will be administering some kind of program that isn't basically a business or an individual entity that we would apply subrecipient rules to. So I would consider a neighborhood organization a nonprofit for the purposes of this federal grant. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, we don't. So the organization does not have to be a 501c3.
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Then, so again, there's this little button here to upload additional documents to support your nonprofit application. We also ask, if you click no, that goes away. We ask if you are a business or an individual. If you click yes, you'll see additional questions come up. This is again where we're hitting that cost reasonableness. If you click yes, that you're going to be seeking funding for construction that will exceed that 2,000 or goods, supplies, or services that will exceed that 3,500 that we talked about earlier. The application then gives you those requirements. And here is where I would suggest you upload your quotes or bids. And then you'll see it said quotes or bids should be submitted utilizing this upload button. You can upload up to 20 here. If you need more, which I can't imagine you will, but maybe you will, then there are different upload buttons throughout the application. It doesn't matter necessarily to us where you submit them. We see them all in the same space on the back end. And then here we ask, does your application include a capital expenditure that exceeds that $1 million? If you click yes, there's a whole bunch of other questions that come up here. These are the questions that I covered earlier, where you're talking about how this capital expenditure is the only possible feasible response to meet the need of the neighborhood, and where you're gonna give us your description of the alternative projects that you explored to show that the capital project that you're proposing is the only right solution to the problem here. And then again, there's another upload button. That's a space to upload additional documents. I will say, if you are planning to propose a capital project that exceeds that $1 million threshold, you may want to have some conversations with me to talk you through that section before you submit the application. I'm totally fine with that. Send me an email. I'll try to walk you through that in a little bit more detail because it is a little bit more complicated and the federal government gives very specific instructions about that. And I will say, if it is a use that is not specifically called out in the federal legislation, we actually have to submit this justification to the Treasury for their review and approval. So you're going to want to make sure you get that right. Okay, moving on to section 4, duplication of benefits. This looks complicated, but it's actually really easy. The idea here is, has the applicant or the applicant agency received any other COVID-19 funding from other sources? We ask this because the federal government does not permit us to provide duplicative benefits for any one need. So in this spot, if you're an applicant, you've received no other sort of COVID-19 related funding, you can totally ignore this section, click no, move on. But if you have, you want to list that out here. It does not preclude you from receiving funding, but we do need to see what else you received to make sure that we're not duplicating anything. So what we've listed here are what we believe are the most likely sources of COVID-19 relief funding that folks may have received. It's also possible that we've missed a category, and that's why the other button is here. But we've sort of included a bunch of different drawdown programs that we're aware of that we know are most common that folks have received funding for. And that way it makes it easier for folks to sort of understand what we're talking about. So you would select that. Maybe your business, you received one of the Prime the Pump grants that the city released in 2020. And those grants were fairly small, so it probably wouldn't have exceeded $10,000. You just put that amount in and you tell us what you used it for. Most folks used it for payroll costs or for immediate supply or marketing costs. You just fill that in. If you received more than Prime the Pump, maybe you also received a PPP loan or grant. That's okay, it's totally fine. You just pop that amount in. Those grants were typically larger than the city's Prime the Pump grants. You put in the dollar amount just like I'm doing here. You'll see it'll automatically total for you at the bottom, so you don't have to worry about adding it all up. And you put in what you used it for, payroll, right? Okay, totally fine. So now let's talk about duplication of benefits. So when I say that you cannot, we can't fund duplicative things, it means we can't fund the exact same thing. So maybe you're a nonprofit and you're seeking funding to run a program, and that's still, there's going to be payroll in that program, right? Like you're going to have to pay a program manager or someone to administer that program. Sure. But you also received some sort of funding previously that covered payroll. That funding likely covered payroll for a certain amount of time and likely does not preclude you from funding payroll for a new program going forward. But sometimes folks find that confusing, so I just want to kind of call that out. We just have to understand what you received funding for and make sure that we're showing that the need was greater than what you received funding for. So likely this will not impact your funding, but we just need to have it here. Now, if you have applied for funding, so say you put in a general ARPA application, you're a community organization, and you're looking for some sort of funding to run a program or do some sort of build out on an existing community facility or something, fine. You already put in an ARPA application, and maybe you put in that ARPA application for $100,000, or maybe you put it in for $500,000, you know? But you're also, you're basically putting in a duplicate application here, and hoping to get funding either way, or maybe to get half of your funding here and half of your funding from the general application. That's fine, but you should put that in there. So you should, where it asks for the use of funding, you should say not awarded yet, application submitted, right? And then down here where we're saying provide any additional information, you should provide additional narrative to say, we put in this application, it hasn't been awarded yet. We don't really care where the funding comes from. We just want to make sure we get the funding, right? So put that description in there. Either way, your sort of your totals automatically total in here. You're providing any additional information. This section is really just to address that duplication. Okay. Moving on to section 5, your capacity to complete the project. So this is where you're really talking about your organization, or you're an applicant that's a business. Show how you're going to complete the project, right? If you're a business, this should be fairly easy. You're probably doing some kind of tenant fit out. Maybe you're doing some kind of exterior improvement. Maybe you're going to build some outdoor space to better meet the needs of, you know, to sort of fit this new economy that we're talking about. Just talk about you've been in business for X number of years. You know, these are your key teams. If you've already selected you've gotten your quotes and you've selected your contractor, talk about your contractor and your contractor's experience. You really want to make the case that the entity that's putting in this application can absolutely carry out the project. There shouldn't be any question here. And then again, you want to provide any relevant experience that shows that the entity putting in the application can carry out the project. There's also an upload box here, right? So also a great place to put in, to attach any supporting documentation to that. So we have an organization that's already submitted an application. They're a nonprofit organization. They want to carry out a program. They submitted the key people that are going to oversee the program and the project, their resumes and their past programmatic experience in a similar field. Okay. So if any of you folks have ever responded to a city RFP before, sort of similar to that, right? You just want to really make the case that you have the ability to carry out the project and meet the goals that have been put forth in the project. And then the last section is additional documents and where you sign and submit your application. So a notarized tax certification form. This is a fairly standard form that the city requires. Here you're basically stating you don't owe taxes in any form, and you're providing either your tax ID number or a social security number, something that allows this to be easily searchable. There is a link to, there should be a link to the tax certification form. You know what? There isn't. It's supposed to be on our website. It's not there. I'll make sure we get the tax certification form up here. I will say it is not required for you to submit the tax certification form in order for us to review your application. But again, just like the DUNS number and some of the other things I'm going to talk about below, if the city does want to award you funding, these are all things you're going to have to submit to us before we can actually go to any kind of contract or get you funding. So if you can attach it with your application, it just makes the process move a lot quicker. But it's not a requirement in order for the city to review the application. There's also an option to attach your agency board of directors, like we talked about for nonprofits, a 501c3 certificate. I will also add 501c4s for neighborhood organizations if you have such a certificate or proof of that organization. Again, any additional
We do.
team member. You do, right. So I'll add that in there so that pops up in the application just to sort of prompt people's memories. Any additional team member resumes, evidence of experience, or description of past comparable projects. Again, none of these things are required to submit your application, but you're building the case for your project. So the more of this that you can submit to show that your organization or the applicant can carry out the project and make it happen and meet sort of the goals that you're laying out with the funding, you should attach it. And so again, you can attach up to 20 documents here. I can't imagine that you're going to have more than that. If for some reason you do, just email me and we can have you email them over or arrange some way for you to get extra documents over to us. I really don't think you're going to have trouble though. And then you just do a quick, easy digital signature and you submit your application. And then you will get this prompt that says, thank you for submitting your application. Your response has been received. You will get a confirmation email. And then here you get, see, you can actually, I don't know if you can see this on my screen, but a prompt just showed up from my email saying the application came in. So I also get a prompt in my email when applications come in. And then here you get a PDF copy of what you submitted. So you have that for your records. If for some reason you accidentally submit it and you didn't mean to submit it, you have two choices. You can resubmit totally new and just send me an email and say, oh my God, I accidentally submitted it. I didn't mean to. I still need to make changes. That's fine. Or we can have you come in and maybe you can make the changes on one of our computers here from the back end of it. But again, I don't really think that's going to happen. You kind of decisively hit the submit button. So that is sort of what I have in terms of technical assistance. I will again take questions from folks if you have any, and then I'm going to do this all over again in like another week or so. So if you want to come back and listen to me talk for an hour and a half again, you are welcome to, or you can email me, you can call me, and I will try to get folks through this application process as best I can. Does anyone have questions?
Thank you.
Okay.
Wow.
Great. Yeah, I hope, I realize that it might seem overwhelming, but I think once you get into it, you're going to realize it's not terribly hard. It's just about making sure you have a fully formed project before you try to submit the application, and you understand sort of the requirements around providing community benefit. So if no one has any questions, I will say thank you and goodbye, and feel free to reach out to me separately. I see someone asking about a copy of this presentation. So I recorded this. My goal is to post it on our division's YouTube channel and then link it to our website. So if you want to rewatch it, you can. I'm assuming it recorded. If for some reason we have technical difficulties and it didn't actually record, but it looks like it's recording. Obviously, my goal is to repost this, but so yes, it should be posted to answer that. All righty. Well, thank you, folks. Good night. If you have specific individual questions, you're welcome to stick around for a minute and I'll try to answer them, or we can set up an appointment to talk further. Thank you.
Good night.